Welcome back to Road Gang Radio. Join Jimmy Mack and Lindsay Lawler's Gang of the Airwaves by subscribing to Radio Nemo on YouTube.
We celebrate all kinds.
Make it official. After all, if you're listening, you're already in the gang. The Road Gang.
Hey guys, coming up at the top of the next hour, the Braz, Robert Braswell, is going to be here for Tech Talk and going to help you avoid scary maintenance issues. After that, Nicholas Gonzalez is coming from Terry Taylor country, Kansas, to talk Johnson County Community College CDL training on Education Station. We're going to have, when Lindsay Lawler gets here to talk about actually getting a life, a little sci-fi thriller discussion with award-winning journalist and author Jeremy Cliff, and we're going to close out the show this morning with one of our favorite people, regular contributing guest, the retrologist himself, Rolando Pujol, who's actually a Sleepy Hollow resident. I don't know if you knew that, Dre. Part of the old legend of Sleepy Hollow. And he's going to be talking about all kinds of spooky places on the highway and on the road. And don't forget, after the replay of last week's We Should Write, Lindsay's got a brand new one as author and soul warrior. Teresa Bruno joins her on a new edition of the best darn deep dive into writing on any platform. We Should Write, coming up at noon in the center, 1 in the East. But what do you say we talk to Dr. Craig Friend first, professor of history and public history at NC State University? I guess we can call this a special edition of Revolution Road.
Yeah.
We can kind of do that, can't we? The name of the lecture is Things That Went Bump in the Night in Early America, and we are joined, as I said before, by a professor of history and public history at North Carolina State University. In 2019, Craig was named NCSU Alumni Association Distinguished Graduate Professor. He's also previously served as president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And in case you haven't figured it out, his research focuses on issues of identity and commemoration, gender and masculinity, and death culture. And Craig Thompson Friend joins us this morning. Good morning, Dr. Friend. Thank you very much. I thought we'd give you a little bit of special introductory music there, a little bit of the spooky season. I got to tell you, you've walked into the right place here, by the way. We love all things spooky, and this is one of my particular obsessions here in regards to how Halloween was kind of celebrated in the early part of this country's history, because I think you can make a case that Halloween, as it is currently incarnated, is actually one of the great examples of how America creates things from other things. But I'd like your take on it. How was Halloween celebrated at the beginning of the Republic?
Oh, I totally agree with your assessment. And one thing we need to think about when we discuss Halloween or any holiday is just like everything else in American culture, it's a blend of many traditions, both immigrant traditions and indigenous traditions. And so Halloween, there's a lot of theory about where Halloween originates, whether it comes out of Celtic cultures or Roman culture. But by the time we get to the early United States, we're talking about the years after the American Revolutionary War, when the nation is taking shape. The people in the United States are celebrating it very much along the lines of Christian traditions. They're acknowledging All Hallows Eve, and then All Saints Day, and then All Souls Day, which were 3 days that comprised All Hallow Tide, which was a religious holiday, but they're also acknowledging Guy Fawkes Day, which was on November 5th. And so they have like a 6-day festival in which they celebrate this Hallowtide. It's very similar to the 12 days of Christmas. And so it's a season of celebration that's going on, and it's both religious and nationalistic. And for the majority of Americans during this time, what they did is they had parties. They called them snap apple parties, and this celebrated the harvest as well. And during these parties, you would acknowledge your ancestors who are gone, who are deceased, some of whom are ghostly because you still think that they visit you. You would predict romantic fortunes for people who are attending the party. There was a myth that if a unmarried girl, looked in a mirror, she would see her future husband behind her during All Hallowtide. They drank a lot, in particular spiced and fermented cider. They sang, they danced, and they dress up like their deceased ancestors. And this practice of dressing up basically came from Irish and Scottish customs, and we call it mumming, which is a term we associate with Mardi Gras nowadays. But mumming took place in a lot of these festival periods. And it was an opportunity to sort of mask one's status, mask one's appearance, and pretend to be something else. And so there was this party culture that took place during All Hallowtide, and they would carve gourds, in particular turnips, and we can talk about that transition in a moment, but. The carving of turnips came from Irish culture, and you would carve a face into a turnip and put a candle inside of it and put it on a stake to ward off spirits on All Hallows Eve and over the next 2 days. And so the carving of gourds, and of course they bobbed for apples. And all of this was part of the snap apple culture that came. I think one thing I want to point out here is it's an adult celebration. It's not designed for children. Children would seldom have attended these parties. These were meant to be very wild. And the term historians and scholars use is misrule, a period of people just acting out.
Shoemaker's holiday. In some ways, it has also some roots in the shoemaker's holiday from Great Britain. The idea of the mass of the ass. It's another reversal form, isn't it? Where it's like it does have a sense of, and that's where kind of the misrule comes from. I put on a costume and I pretend to be something I'm not, so I can get away with a little bit of murder, metaphorically, right?
Oh, sure. And during, we are probably familiar that during the Christmas season, people put on their mumming costumes and went around wassailing, singing, demanding drink, demanding gifts. That was very much part of the Halloween practice that eventually becomes known as trick or treat. But you can imagine putting on costumes, wandering from house to house, released a lot of social pressure. People who were poorer could bang on the doors of their wealthy neighbors, which they weren't allowed to do most of the year, and demand food or some sort of gift. So in urban areas, this was a great social release for poor people who can now interact with the wealthy on All Hallows Eve and during the 5 days following. But if we even think about plantations in the South, enslaved people were permitted to go to the main house and demand some sort of treat, both during the Christmas season and during the Halloween season. And so, this mumming practice and this demanding for food was very much a release valve for social pressures.
I wanted to read you a quote, and I think you'll recognize it once I start reading it, because I want to take a little bit of a detour here, but you'll get this. Such heaped upon platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the dowdy donut, the tender oily cake, the crisp and crumbling cruller, the sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were the apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chicken. And by the way, that goes on and on and on. That is the table spread at the Von Tassel house during the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And by the way, there are websites now that actually show you how to cook all of those things in case you want to replicate that meal. That kind of also speaks to this overall sense of a lot of people participated, and when you've got when you've got indigenous cultures and Dutch cultures and Anglo-Saxon cultures and German cultures and all these people that are kind of existing in this new world, everybody's bringing their own particular fall festival and their own particular mumming or costume or minstrel festival. And it really is the genuine, it's more of a stew than a melting pot because you can actually discern the pieces from it. But it really is an American holiday. I mean, and you believe that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And one thing I would throw into the mix here is the quote you just read from Washington Irving, is coming from a period in American history where the nation is transitioning from an older, more traditional economy to capitalism. And we're beginning to see the rise of a middle class. And so being able to define how middle class and wealthy people could live and how well they could live and how they could support their neighbors and so on became part of that culture. And so that's why you see him go into such detail there about the delectables on the table. And so that piece you read is not only indicative of the blending of cultures, but also the evolution of the nation itself into something different by the middle of the 19th century, which is a nation with a strong, notable middle class and a defined capitalist system.
Okay, really quickly, I want to give you time because there's so much to cover here, and Dr. Friend is here, and this is a wonderful conversation about the origins of American Halloween all the way up to the Civil War. Of course, after that meal gets eaten, in that story's progression, as Washington Irving tells it, they all then gather around the fire, and a tradition that actually existed at Christmas as well, too. So the meal has been eaten, and then the ghost stories begin. And I was kind of curious if you could unpack the tradition of ghost storytelling in early America.
Well, I mean, that's part of the Irish tradition that came over with the snap apple parties, is that you would sit around and talk about the deceased. And it evolved into talking about deceased who were menacing, right? And so you had the evolution of ghost stories. Most Americans believed in ghosts during this time, and there were actually significant ghost stories that came out of every part of the American nation. The most famous was the Edgefield ghost in South Carolina in the 1820s, who was a spirit who spoke to an entire family. They brought in clergy. They brought in, quote, specialists who would have called themselves magicians or something like that to try to identify who the ghost was. And the ghost only stopped after a year of interacting with this family when the father told the children not to talk to it anymore. And so they stopped hearing this ghost. Is there an explanation for it? None that anyone has been able to find. There's sort of individual ghosts throughout the colonies, these ghost stories. By the 1840s, the tradition of ghost storytelling transitions into spiritualism, and you actually have the rise of mediums who are going to have seances. And this is sort of encouraged by a story out of Rochester, New York, of ghosts that rapped on a house. Now, later it was discovered that this was all fraud, that two of the daughters had been involved in perpetuating this. But for a long time, it had a lot of, quote, specialists stumped as to the ghosts. And so ghost stories, they also had spirits that they called hobgoblins. And if you think about the Harry Potter movie, the goblins in that are very much physically based upon the myth of hobgoblins. They had jack-o'-lanterns, which at that time were what we would call swamp lights, lights that floated above the ground. So you can sort of imagine the evolution of that into a light inside of a head, whether it's a turnip or a pumpkin, sitting on a porch or sitting on a stump above the ground. Swamp lights often pulled people into swamps where they would be found the next day or a couple days later.
Will-o' the wisp.
Yes, yes.
Really quickly,
And of course, yeah,
I
go
just,
ahead.
I just want to say this too. We got to do a little bureaucracy here. In case you guys are just joining us, Professor Craig Friend is joining us this morning, and we are discussing things that went bump in the night in early America. I also would like to point out that his latest book, Becoming Lunsford Lane, is about an enslaved man who found his way to freedom and abolitionism after escaping a lynching in 1842, which, by the way, as he points out, is another type of early American horror altogether. That came out in May from the University of North Carolina Press and can be found over at uncpress.org. We are pleased to have him this morning. If you want to give the good doctor a call and talk about all things Halloween, you are welcome to do so at 615-292-6366. Want to give a quick shout out on our chat this morning to Joe J., Trucker Bosun, and James Billingsley, along with Tara Garris and Bruce Almighty, who all send the word out to you and say good morning. Just wanted to take care of all that kind of stuff for you, Dr. Friend. Let's pick up where you just left off, if you don't mind.
Oh, I was going to say they also, as we probably all know, had belief in witches. The Salem witchcraft trials were 100 years earlier, but in Philadelphia, while the founding fathers were writing the Constitution, there was actually an attack on a woman who was accused of being a witch. She was stabbed to death in the streets. We often don't think about that. We think Philadelphia is this enlightened city where they're creating a nation, but there's this other side of America, right? And so there was an attack on a witch there. In the 1790s, we have witch trials in South Carolina, in Kentucky, and the way they sort of determined who was a witch is if somebody's cattle are dying next door, or and then these trials didn't even take place in courtrooms. They were sort of kangaroo courts that were set up often in churches where elderly single women, in most cases, were accused of witchcraft. And the case in South Carolina, 3 women were accused, and eventually they were whipped, and then they were hanged by their wrists, and fire was put to their feet so that the souls burned off their feet. The case in Kentucky, the woman, they sliced her forehead open to make her drink her own blood as a cure for whatever they thought she was doing in the community. And so, it's a horrible imagery that people actually went through these punishments. And then there were male, quote, witches as well, which they called magicians. That was the term they used for them at that time. We might call them witch doctors. They were more commonly found among enslaved communities, male practitioners of witchcraft. For example, one of them was a guy named Gullah Jack, who joined Denmark Vesey in trying to rebel in 1822. He was eventually hanged with him, but he was casting spells against the enslavers as part of that rebellion. And so there's a wide variety of spirits and other earthly beings, preternatural beings who are interfering supposedly in human life that early Americans believed in. And these were pretty strong beliefs. But then in the 1820s, we begin to see children's books being written that tell children that none of this is real. And children are now being increasingly being taught not to believe in these types of beings. That doesn't mean beliefs went away. And of course, in the 1820s and 1830s, we see the rise of Romanticism and Gothic horror. And the Gothic movement is certainly going to grab onto most of these types of beings and use them as metaphors for human feelings and human emotions and human activity. And so they'll perpetuate these sorts of ideas about these beings.
Yeah, and that's a one of the things I realized too is that often witches, magicians, and and cunning men are often our reaction to things in the world that we can't explain. What is it that magic is only science that has not yet been discovered, and then people have these reactions. They overreact. They punish the wrong person, and then ghosts end up being the kind of the embodiment of our guilt over having done something we know wasn't right. A lot of the ghost traditions that spring out of the early colonial period and up to this day, we always hear about woods that are haunted by witches. There's always the thing of
Oh yeah.
we punish some innocent person, and now having punished them, they return as the very thing that they warrant to punish us. And so much of this is guilt, and I wonder if the movement. And I'm really asking you this question. I'm not speculating here. I wonder if some of that urge in the 1820s to kind of tell kids this isn't real is that people begin to realize, man, we're scaring the hell out of a lot of children, and even in that time period, maybe this isn't the best way to go about raising kids, to having them live in a perpetual state of fear. Was that part of the motivation for why they begin to kind of pull it back a little bit, or is it that
Oh,
romanticism and Age of Enlightenment stuff that kind of kicks in?
well, part of romanticism was the embrace of romantic love.
Right.
Ideas about love began to change, and this relates to children as well. Children were largely viewed, I hate to say as little adults, but they were not viewed as a separate category of living the way we view children today, that there's a certain period of time of innocence that needs to be protected. That early Americans didn't believe that. Children often worked on farms, in shops. Children were with adults most of the time. Most Americans lived in houses that had few private rooms, so children had, saw things that we would think, was inappropriate today. Um, and so in the 1820s, 1830s, with the rise of Romanticism, we see this new approach, this new idea about how to treat children, that they should be treated special, that they should be protected. That's part of our love for them. And so, yes, we're going to try to protect them from what previously people had believed to be supernatural and out of control. We're going to give them new opportunities like gifts at Christmas, gifts at Halloween, candy at Halloween, rather than pies or whatever
It's also
that may have been given earlier.
it's your middle class theory at play too, because as the American people get a little more wealthy, they also have more space. They're not crammed into London. They're not crammed into Paris. They can build out, which means additional rooms, which means that people are really examining privacy now, and
Yeah.
the idea that. And even if you are viewing your children as property, and many people did, or at least until they got old enough, then you're beginning to say, you know what, maybe I should cultivate this. Maybe I should begin to think about ways in which I can, all these farmers, of course, are then thinking about tilling their fields. And so there might be some kind of middle class rural metaphor here for the idea that I want this to be a strong crop. And one thing I can do to stop that is to make sure that I reward it and, not scare the hell out of it on a regular basis, but love it. That might actually work as a strategy. Nice mercantile, middle class, capitalist strategy for a child raising. I mean,
And without digressing, I'm not going to digress much. I'm just going to say, and you can imagine the implications of all of this change for things like inheritance laws, right? Who actually gets to inherit property from their father, which previously had been the first son, right? But now you want to love all your children equally, and you want to treat all of them. And so there's implications in the law, in economics, in society generally. There's all sorts of ways in which this manifests, and it manifests in Halloween as well. Halloween eventually or starts to transition from an adult celebration to a children's celebration. Children are the ones who dress up. Children are the ones who go out and trick or treat. Some of their trick or treating is really nasty, lots of rough tricks performed on people, but that was allowed because it's still a misrule celebration. But the people who are misruling are now children, right? It's children approaching adults rather than the poor approaching the rich. And children get to sort of move, become sort of the center or the focus of social activities on this one evening.
Yeah, and you're
And the
also
same
not
will
having
happen
it.
with Christmas.
Yeah, you don't have adults walking around with built-up rage over an entire year of them being told, do what you wanna. And, then you have basically people. And by the way, there are examples in Europe of people walking around with clubs, payback time. If you make it kids, it's a lot more fun, a lot more joyful to kind of watch it unfold, I guess, is another kind of point, too. So it's great stuff. We're almost out of time here. Tell us just a little bit about Becoming Lunsford Lane in the last moment we have here.
Well, Lunsford Lane was born in 1803, enslaved in Raleigh. He 30 some years later purchased himself because you couldn't buy freedom in North Carolina. So he purchased his body, his property, and eventually went and found emancipation in New York. A few years later, he came back to purchase his family, and upon arriving in Raleigh, North Carolina, was attacked by a mob who tried to lynch him. He escaped and took his family to New England, and over the course of a decade was on the abolitionist circuit with partners like Frederick Douglass. And so the story I tell of him is of a man who finds his way to freedom, struggles in freedom, and Lunsford is also sort of lost to us as a historical character because he didn't align with the goals of the abolitionist movement the way many of the people we remember did. And so it complicates our understanding of abolitionism and the purpose that abolitionists had in ending slavery.
By the way,
So
guys,
that's the book in a nutshell.
and by the way, guys, it is a forgotten figure no more because Becoming Lunsford Lane is now available. It came out in May from the University of North Carolina Press. My friend, we are out of time, but I wanted to tell you happiest of Halloweens. The first part of this show is usually about truck drivers making a living, but they're big readers and they're big lovers of tradition and history. So we thought we'd make some space on this wonderful week for you. Thank you for dropping in and making